So welcome back to International School History Teacher, and this series of lessons looking at the rise, the consolidation and rule of authoritarian states. In our last lesson we were looking at the distinctive characteristics of modern authoritarianism that emerged from the ashes of the First World War. This was a war that had swept aside the traditional authoritarianism of kings and kaisers and tsars, replacing this old order with the sorts of liberal democracy that had been threatening European elites since the revolutions of 1789 and 1848. It was opposition to this liberal democracy that would define the new authoritarianism. On the authoritarian left, communists saw liberal democracy as a smokescreen, an illusion of power that prevented the newly enfranchised working class from fully appreciating the real source of their exploitation, capitalism. In 1917, Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power, both political and economic, and established a party dictatorship to lead the exploited classes to the promised land of a workers' state. On the ideological right, fascists were similarly critical of liberal democracy, but appealed rather to the goals of national regeneration, the cult of action, the obedience to a strong man that could cut through all that unnecessary parliamentary chatter. If the communists looked to an imagined future, the political right, in contrast, drew inspiration from an imagined past, a past of natural hierarchy and social authority in which ordinary men and women, especially women, knew their place. So what was it about the period after 1918 that made it so difficult for democracy to survive? In addressing this question, we will also be uncovering the underlying conditions that encourage authoritarian states to emerge. Any explanation for the emergence of authoritarian states can be separated into the structural conditions that make the rise to power possible, or even likely, and the methods used by authoritarians to seize that power. In brief, we are going to look at the role of structural factors in this lesson, and later, in a second lesson, we'll concern ourselves with the role of human agency. Authoritarian regimes are unusual in countries that are rich, socially stable, and that have a tradition of constitutionally limited civilian government. If they do emerge in these sorts of countries, it is usually the result of a crisis brought about by external factors such as war or an international economic crisis. As usual, the history teacher's favourite acronym, PESC, is a good way to go about organising these structural factors. PESC, the political, economic, social and cultural conditions that encourage the rise to power of authoritarian states. To PESC we'll add the W of war, which deserves a category and a future lesson in its own right. So the P of PESC are the political factors that contribute to the rise of authoritarian regimes. And these are concerned with governance and power. A state, via its government, is supposed to use its power to protect and respect the interests of the citizens, protect the frontiers, raise and use tax money fairly and efficiently, to provide essential services, etc. The rise to power of most authoritarian regimes occurs in states where state institutions are poorly developed, little respected, and prone to corruption, where they are becoming what political science calls a failed state. So the failure of Weimar Germany in the 1930s to produce a stable government capable of dealing with that unemployment crisis, or the failure of Russia's provisional government in 1917 to impose its authority on the workers' councils, the Soviets, are both examples of a systemic political weakness. People lacked confidence in the political institutions that were supposed to represent and manage their interests. The E of PESC are the economic factors that are concerned with the wealth of a country, how it makes and distributes that wealth. With the exception of the oil-rich states in the Middle East, most non-democratic states in the world today are relatively poor, Modern democracy has traditionally required a relatively affluent, urbanized and well-educated population if it is to be effective. When capitalism fails to provide economic security, or when significant economic inequalities emerge, the democratic system associated with it loses credibility.
I supported Hitler because he, after having seen all that depravity, all that poverty here, was the only one who could do social justice to the people here. They were in a terrible misery.
Economic factors are often fundamental causes in the rise of authoritarianism because they help accentuate or to trigger other causes. Economic crises lead to calls for political change, and underlying religious and ethnic divisions can often only be contained if the economy is growing enough to provide people with an acceptable standard of living. And the classic example is the Great Depression of the 1930s, which resulted in widespread unemployment, poverty and inequality, undermining many of the newly democratic regimes that had been created in the aftermath of the First World War. The S of PESC is concerned with social division. Divisions between groups of people in society and how these divisions make it difficult for the state to peacefully manage a community of often competing interests. Social division comes in many different forms: class division, religious, ethnic, tribal, national, linguistic, gender, age, etc. In the absence of a sense of a shared community, a community identity, what the sociologist Durkheim called social solidarity, it is difficult for the state to maintain authority and easy for unscrupulous politicians to encourage the persecution of social minorities and to abuse the human rights essential to that of living in a democratic society. After World War I, groups of people that had lived successfully alongside each other under an empire could not do so easily when literally left to their own devices. For example, the newly post-war Polish state under Marshal Pilsudski included 14% Ukrainians, 9% Jews, 3% Belarusians, 2% Germans, along with other minorities. And after years of border wars and political instability and a hyperinflation crisis, democracy was finally abandoned in 1926. In fact, of all the successor states, the Central European successor states created at the end of the First World War, only Czechoslovakia and Finland were still democracies by the time of the outbreak of the Second World War. Cultural factors, the C of PESC, that contribute to the rise to power of authoritarian regimes, are concerned less with the measurable material influence of those social and economic factors we've looked at, and more with the less tangible spiritual and intellectual lives of the people, their beliefs, their thoughts and expectations. The concept of political culture is useful in helping us to understand the cultural conditions in which authoritarian regimes are more likely to come to power. Where there is what a sociologist might call a participant political culture, it is much more difficult to impose authoritarian rule because there is already a tradition, a civic tradition, in which people expect to influence the government. This contrasts with subject political culture, such as existed in the traditional authoritarian regimes of Central and Eastern Europe before the Great War, before the First World War, or in parochial political culture, where the state is not centralized and where citizens have neither the knowledge nor the interest in politics. This would have been the case, for example, in the newly decolonized parts of Africa in the early 1960s. So what we have learnt in this lesson is that an appreciation of the underlying structural conditions which give rise to authoritarian states is central to any explanation of how these states emerge. Institutional political weaknesses, economic crises and inequality, social divisions and cultural traditions all influence the ease with which authoritarianism is established. But a final structural factor that needs to be considered in addition to PESC is the importance of war. And this will be the subject of our next lesson. Architecture of amnesia. the people with hysteria, architecture of amnesia, history lessons disappear.